back to another one of my digital painting time-lapse videos. With this painting, I really wanted to incorporate sceneries from closer to home. If you're familiar with any of my previous work, I'm usually drawing more fantastical scenes such as snow-capped mountains, sprawling deserts, and like even underwater scenes. But none of them really showcase any of the environment that's around where I live, which is in Malaysia. And in Malaysia, we have a lot of tropical rainforesty kind of scenes, and I have not really featured any of these in my work. Mangrove swamps are a pretty familiar scene here in Malaysia, and I've managed to visit quite a few of them. I think the main reason why I overlooked mangrove swamps as like a potential painting is because they just look so messy. That's the best way I can describe it. It just looks so messy. There are roots and muddy waters and just branches and leaves all over the place. It's just very difficult to arrange things in a pleasing manner. But in this painting, I kind of have another main character, or two main characters, to kind of draw the attention away from the mangrove swamp. But it still plays a very big role in setting the mood for the painting. So that's a little introduction to the piece. Let's dive right into the painting process. Right, so I start the painting just like how I start most of my paintings, and that's usually by doing a sketch, whether it be with line art or with just black and white graphic shapes. Most of the time I would do several thumbnail sketches, but at this time I was already pretty sure of what I want to paint. So I was going for a very central composition. So these branches of the mangrove tree, they're kind of setting a stage for a main character of the piece. In the beginning, I wanted to put a giant bird, but I feel like it didn't really match the scene. So eventually I scrapped that idea and went with the giant snake instead. I only very lightly sketched the snake in before I got distracted and wanted to paint the rest of the environment first. This actually happens pretty often. I just prefer working on backgrounds more, so the main characters don't really interest me that much. I already knew what kind of lighting that I want to go with, so I picked this very warm green and yellow color palette. And I'm a big fan of having the light source be behind our main character so that it can produce a very high contrast silhouette. So that's kind of what I'm setting up here. After a very simple background layer, I start to block in some of the mangrove trees. I'm using very flat colors in the beginning, and I'm not focusing too much on rendering. I just strategically placed the light areas and the dark shadow areas of the mangrove trees. And for the highlights, I'm using a very bright and warm yellow. And in the shadows, I'm using a cooler grayish green. I also take care to lighten the underside of these branches because that's the result of the light being reflected off of the water. So with a very basic background blocked in, I go back to trying to block in the snake. And at this point, I was trying to come up with a pose for the snake from my imagination, but I felt like it didn't feel convincing enough. This pose doesn't look very natural. So I went and looked up some references for actual snakes, and I came up with this pose instead, which I feel like this one looks way more natural, way more snake-like. In the previous pose, the snake just looks like it didn't look like it was made out of like organic matter. It felt more like a plastic hose that's just coiled around this branch. But in this pose, it felt like there are actually muscles inside of the snake, and they're actively holding the snake up. I'm pretty happy with the initial blocking of the snake, so I start to go back towards the background. I started working on the area above the snake where it looked really empty at that point. I wasn't doing much. All I did was to try and paint some leaf and foresty textures. The goal was to suggest that it's a very dense mangrove forest and you can't really see past the forest. I definitely could have used a textured brush for this, but I kinda enjoy painting everything by hand. After fiddling around with the background for a bit, I start to actually paint in some of the light effects. I knew I wanted the light to be warm. That's the way that I'm gonna get the most contrast and atmosphere. So I'm going with a very orange light. A light so orange that you will never see this in real life, but you know, this is a fantasy painting, so anything can happen. I center the warm glow right behind the snake's head. It doesn't really make any sense, but I put it there anyways, so that I can draw the most attention to the head, which is the focal point. I also put some of the warm light in the water and on the mangrove trees around the center, and have it fall off as it gets further and further away from the center. And while we're on lighting, I took the opportunity to add in some dramatic light shafts. These are here to justify the very bright highlights on the edges of the mangrove trees and also on the snake. And in addition, they act as very subtle leading lines, and it helps to bring the viewer's eye away from the edge of the canvas and back into the center of the painting. And at this point, we're at the very boring stage where I'm just painting in leaves and textures on the branches. So I'm gonna speed up the time lapse. Well, time lapses are already sped up, but it's gonna be faster. And usually at some point in my painting, once I have enough colors and details, I like to slap on a curves adjustment layer and also a color balance adjustment layer. This is where I start to bump up the contrast and the saturation of the painting. I find that it's best not to do it too early or too late in the painting. If I do it too early, then the adjustment layer won't have enough information to work off of. And if I just bump up the contrast that way, I'll get a very kind of flat and graphic image, if that makes sense. And I also don't want to do it too late, because boosting the contrast and the saturation actually saves me a lot of time. If I don't use these adjustment layers, I will eventually paint my way to the end result that I want. But you know, that could easily be achieved using curves and a color balance. And now we've arrived at the part of the painting that I've been procrastinating on for a bit, and that is to draw or paint the scales onto this snake. My first attempt at doing the scales is through downloading some textures online and trying to warp them into perspective, but that didn't go so well. It was very difficult to work with the warp tool, especially with the very low-res free texture files I could find online. Eventually, the solution that I went with is to visit the Clip Studio asset store, and it's crazy that I found snake scale brushes available for free, and these brushes are actually really high quality, and there were even multiple types of snake scales in there. I was really surprised at how specific these assets were, and they were completely free, which is also very surprising. So if you use Clip Studio, go do yourself a favor and check it out. There are so many free assets that are available for download, and they can definitely save you a ton of time, like it did here for me. enough about the asset store. So I didn't just put on the texture on the snake's skin. I also painted in some of the light reflections on the scales. I think this really suggests more detail than is actually present on the snake itself. But yeah, since I'm happy with the snake, I decided to now fill in some of the more empty parts of the scene. So this is the space above the snake and also in the foreground. I experimented with adding some other roots, some other plants. And it was really a trial and error process. I went with the cheap and easy blur the foreground trick here with the roots. And as for the tree in the background, I thought it would be nice to fill in some of the empty space above the snake, but I couldn't really make it work because it looks too busy and it distracts too much from the focal point. Looking back at the time lapse, I'm realizing that the foliage in the foreground doesn't really make sense. The perspective is a bit off because the camera is positioned quite a bit higher than like an average height of a person. You can see that the human on the boat is quite a bit lower than the camera. So it doesn't make sense that the foliage can grow up to this high in the foreground. Yeah, it's just something I noticed after looking back. Well, sometimes it's useful to look back at your paintings. And now we're almost at the end of the painting. My usual process is to export it and bring it into Photoshop, where I do some light and color adjustments before adding in the final few details. And that's the end of the painting. I hope you enjoyed watching it come to life. And if you got any sort of value from this video, I would really appreciate it if you could give me a like or subscribe, because that will help the channel out a lot. Thank you, and as always, I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.